Good morning, everybody. Can you guys hear us? Yes? Okay, perfect. All right, before we get started, I've been asked to read some instructions. So here are some of the instructions from ISPOR. ISPOR encourages your involvement in social media, but requests that all devices be silenced during the session. Recording of any type is not permitted in the session room. Please use the disinfected headsets on your chair for best audio experience. Please leave the headset on the chair at the end of the session. Your feedback is incredibly important to ISPOR. Please complete the post-conference evaluation, which will be included in the post-conference email. All right, with that, I welcome you to the HUR Theater. The title of our presentation is IRA Becoming America's HTA? So when we came up with this title, we thought it was a provocative title, but when it comes to pricing of pharmaceuticals in the US, everything seems to be a little bit in a chaotic situation. So with that, I'm going to get started. And we'll take questions at the end because we'll need to wear our headsets. So by the way of introduction, my name is Priti Jhingran. I am the Vice President of Evidence and HUR Strategy. And with me, I have Tijana Ignjatovic, Vice President of Access and Pricing Strategy. We're both affiliated with Genesis Research Group. Genesis Research is a global healthcare consulting organization with expertise in HEOR, RWE, as well as access and pricing. All right, so the learning objectives of this session is going to be to explore whether the IRA's Medicare drug negotiation program is functioning very similar to health technology assessments. For those of you, sorry about that. Just by the way of essentially providing some context here, IRA introduces a negotiation mechanism for U.S. drug pricing where it allows CMS to negotiate directly with pharmaceutical companies. And we'll be talking a whole lot more during the next 20 minutes. I do realize that this has been a very hot topic at this conference. I also do realize that there's a lot of anxiety and chaos about the executive order, which President Trump passed on Monday this week. So time is to tell in terms of what this all means. But we have a few things which probably are unique to our presentation, and hopefully you haven't heard that in the conference, because this may be the fourth or the fifth IRA presentation at this conference. The agenda for today's presentation is we'll go a little bit into the introductions and then compare IRA to HTAs, talk about the role of ICER in IRA, then go into the impact of IRA on product life cycle, lessons learned from the first round. As you know, we've completed one round of negotiations, and then some key takeaways. All right, so when it comes to the evidence requirements for IRA dossiers, which are submitted by the manufacturers, essentially you can see some of the elements are very similar to what an HTA dossier or submission package looks like. So similar to HTAs, your submission package or evidence requirements which are included in the evaluations when the negotiations happen under the IRA Act include the clinical benefit. So that would include the safety as well as the efficacy of the product. But it's always comparative. It's relative to alternative treatment options in that therapy area or for that disease state. Cost effectiveness or the economic value or economic cost offsets are very much also part of the evidence package. One additional thing which the IRA has requested is market data, insights into pricing, sales, practice patterns, utilization patterns, as well as cost of manufacturing and cost of R&D. Lastly, real-world evidence plays a key role in these negotiations, and primarily because these discussions and negotiations happen several years after launch, and we'll be talking a whole lot more about that in the rest of the presentation. So, as I mentioned earlier in the previous slide, that cost effectiveness is part of the IRA negotiations. However, it's a little bit different than what you see in the HTA assessments. In the HTA assessments, especially for markets which are driven by cost effectiveness analysis, qualies or quality thresholds or willingness to pay thresholds have a critical role. However, by law, use of qualies is not permitted to safeguard recommendations that could be discriminatory. What CMS has done is that they keep their doors open. So they do want to see all the information associated with the economics behind the product, including, as I mentioned earlier, the cost of manufacturing, as well as the impact of use of the product on economic outcomes. But essentially, they cannot use qualies. So essentially, everything can be used except for qualies in the economic space. The way these negotiations happen is you start with an index price or a list price, and then qualitatively you adjust these prices up and down. And there's so much more details when it comes to these price negotiations. It's almost a topic in itself. But what's different about the IRA negotiations is that it's qualitative as well as quantitative, and it's on a case-by-case basis. And we'll talk more about some of the specifics in terms of how IRA is different than HTAs in my next slide. All right, so when we compare IRA to global HTA, you'll see that there are some similarities, but there are some differences as well. I'll first go into the similarities. So there are some areas where the IRA approach mirrors global HTA. Firstly, similar to HTA, IRA also takes into account the total net benefit of the product, which includes the safety, efficacy, unmet need, as well as economic impact. This net benefit, which is core to these negotiations, is always relative. It's relative to the alternative option. So the focus is more on comparative effectiveness rather than just looking at the absolute clinical benefit. As you guys probably already know, that IRA takes into consideration the totality of labeled indications. So a molecule or a drug may be indicated for multiple different disease states. So it's the totality of the indication which is taken into consideration when the negotiations happen and the fair market value is assessed. RWE data is important in the HTA space, but it's also important in IRA. But there's more importance is put on real-world evidence in the IRA negotiations, primarily because of the fact that the product is already in the market and you have more real-world data available. Especially what they're wanting is comparative data so that they can understand how one product performs relative to others. When it comes to patient and provider input, so multi-stakeholder input, you do see input from patients as well as provider in the HTA process as well as IRA. What's different between HTAs and IRA? So as I mentioned earlier, the use of qualies is very much prohibited from being included in the negotiations when these negotiations happen in the US with the CMS. I also mentioned earlier there is stronger emphasis on real-world evidence, primarily because of the fact that products have been in the market at a minimum 7+ years, so you have more real world data available. Budget impact and the affordability assessment is very much core to many of the HTAs. It's not part of the negotiations when it comes to IRA. However, when they're selecting these drugs, they basically prioritize high spend drugs. When it comes to external reference pricing, IRA does not use external reference pricing. Pricing is focused on US market dynamics. However, based on the executive order from Trump as of Monday, it's a little bit uncertain right now in terms of how reference prices from ex-US markets are going to have a role in the future when it comes to the assessment of price in the US for pharmaceuticals. HTAs do not include manufacturing costs, whereas IRA does request manufacturers to provide cost of R&D as well as manufacturing costs. And lastly, CMS does not determine coverage. Negotiations only basically determine the market fair price, but whether the drug remains reimbursed or what restrictions are put in place is really not part of the negotiations. Eventually, that comes into play, but that's not part of the negotiations. The negotiations would only help you set up the MFP. Now, the interplay between ICER and IRA, just briefly, what you see or what we've observed is that, firstly, neither the IRA statute or CMS formal guidance indicates that ICER, or in this case, I'm talking about the Institute of Clinical and Economic Review. So essentially, IRA ruling or CMS do not indicate that ICER has a role in this whole process. However, the evidence packages which are put together by ICER in the evaluations which they conduct for a product have very similar evidence, and that is obviously relevant to the IRA negotiations as well. So ICER assessments and reports have a part in the evidence pool. In fact, if you look at the list of references which are used to inform these negotiations, you will see the use of ICER reports. What ICER has also done is that they have issued special reports as well as webinars very close to the release date or release date of when the data submissions are requested by CMS. Case in point, the fact that special reports this year were generated by ICER for Trilogy as well as for Brio. In addition to that, ICER did webinars and white paper on Wegovy as well. All of these products are currently are going through an assessment and evaluation from a negotiation perspective. So all the elements which are part of the ICER report essentially would be relevant for these negotiations. However, as I mentioned earlier, the only thing which cannot be used is the quali element of the cost effectiveness analysis. However, CMS can glean insights from the underlying clinical data, which is informing a cost effectiveness evaluation. So certainly, it's time is to tell whether ICER's role is going to increase over time. However, right now, they've taken an opportunistic role in informing and making sure that the evidence which they have pulled together for the assessment of a certain product is available for these IRA negotiations. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tijana, and she's going to walk you through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Priti. In the next section of the presentation, we'll be looking at the implications of IRA on the product lifecycle. As Priti mentioned, one uniqueness of the IRA process is that, in a way, it turns the HTA on its head by conducting an evaluation many years post-launch and negotiating the price. Another specificity of this process is that it does not treat all molecules, all medicines in the same way. It makes a clear distinction between the small molecule drugs, those approved under the NDA process, by making them eligible for selection for the MFP negotiation 4 years ahead of the biologic counterparts approved under the BLA. Now, having a different treatment of small molecules and biologics is not really the first time we see. We do have different exclusivity provisions. However, this has really been highlighted as one potential disincentive to further investment in the small molecule drugs. And we've seen a number of various legislative attempts to eliminate that difference. And the most pronounced or visible proposal has been the EPIC Act, which has been put forward and recently reintroduced into Congress. What this act seeks to do is to align or extend the trigger for the small molecule negotiation with the biologics and eliminate this disincentive. This is a bipartisan support act, so we'll see where it goes and if things change for the small molecules going forward. Notwithstanding these differences between NDAs and BLAs, clearly the IRA does have some implications for the free drug period in the US for the Medicare segment. And to illustrate that and to look a little bit further, we conducted an analysis, directional analysis, comparing to what extent that free pricing period could be shortened by the IRA negotiation. So if you look at this analysis, we see that on average, potentially 2 years shortening of the free pricing period versus the loss of exclusivity. It is approximate because the loss of exclusivity dates can be a bit tricky to determine. They can change based on various patents and whether they're upheld or challenged. But on average, we are landing at about 2 years. And this is for the drug selected for the first negotiation. If you look at the second cycle, a similar picture emerges. So we have variability between products, but on average 2 years shortening. And that's certainly not an insignificant number when we think about the ROI. Another relevant aspect to consider is the fact that under the negotiation, the MFP is a single price that applies across all of the drug's indications, all of the molecules indications, and presentations and regimens. So it really does not allow for differentiation between different indications and potentially creates a disincentive to have an indication expansion, particularly in cases where it could be in a lower value indication, which dilutes the ROI across the board. We don't have an opportunity for an indication-specific pricing, not something we can do easily in other markets either, but really taken off the table here. There's also no provision for evaluating any synergistic effects or differential value in combination. So as a result, we really now have unintended consequences where the manufacturers may forego indication extensions, and we've been involved in some of conversation in that directions where the indication extension is either delayed or deprioritized completely. And that has implication in terms of patient access and meeting their unmet needs. What we are now going to do is look at some of the lessons we have gleaned from the first round of negotiations. Before we dive in, I just want to share that the opinions that we'll be discussing through in the next few slides are based not only on the MFP negotiation documents that have been published for each drug, because these are fairly opaque and vague, but also looking at all the evidence that was submitted and referenced in those documents, as well as the published CMS guidance, and in general, the discussions we've been involved with and our experience in this space. So let's first look at the factors which are emerging as more impactful in supporting a favorable price outcome. The order in which these factors are listed here is by no means a hard and fast rule in terms of their hierarchy, But what is emerging at the top is the importance of comparative data versus CMS's choice of therapeutic alternatives. So really, those drugs that clearly demonstrate improvement in outcomes versus relevant alternatives have a better chance of securing a positive outcome. That CMS choice of therapeutic alternatives can sometimes be a bit tricky and unpredictable, but is really critical because it sets the baseline for that entry price from which the negotiated price will be set. Secondly, robust RWE can be used to support RCT data. We do see lots of products that fared better in the negotiation really had that as a reference in their package. And because of the uniqueness of this big reassessment under the IRA coming many years after launch, it does provide an opportunity to leverage such evidence. Demonstration of cost offsets can also add to the value arguments. Even though CMS cannot look at QALYs, there's nothing preventing them from actually looking at other outcomes that feed into the Medicare bottom line. So looking at reduction in hospitalizations, emergency room visits, and value across a longer time horizon. Having robust subgroup data is also important. CMS guidance certainly emphasizes the need to present evidence in underserved populations, Medicare relevant populations, as another way to showcase differentiation versus competitors. And finally, because of the cross-indication assessment, really putting the best foot forward across all the indications and not just the lead indication is critical. On the flip side, the elements that appear to be less impactful are listed here. So firstly, the justification of cost based on R&D spend. So this is a data point that is submitted. It is considered as a totality of the package. However, so far we haven't seen any indications that the higher R&D spend can really support a higher MFP. Second, having generic arguments about differentiation, for example, unique mechanism of action, having being first in class or anything like that, those arguments are not really resonating. CMS has clearly indicated preference for hard data and preferably comparative head-to-head data followed by ITCs, network meta-analysis, and so on. RWE, as we mentioned before, is important, but only if supported by robust methodology and having relevant outcomes. When we think about patient and provider input, I would say the jury is a bit out on that one. Certainly it is considered, and we see frequent mentions of it in the CMS documents. However, when we look at how this argumentation fares in other HTA, international HTAs where provider and patient output is considered, and we can make some extrapolations there, we believe that it's this anecdotal evidence is less likely to really be providing support, where this information can be more impactful is when it's supported or followed up by hard evidence and ideally data-backed PROs. And lastly, lack of clear justification or cost justification for premium pricing would be another downside, even though the CMS's assessment is more qualitative rather than quantitative in nature. They do want hard evidence to be presented. So we can now summarize some of the implications based on what we've discussed today and just seen so far. I think our opinions on this are going to evolve, particularly as we go through and see the outcomes of the second round of negotiations. But what's really becoming clear is that IRA is having a significant impact on the U.S. market, and I think that's probably illustrated just how much we are talking about it both at this meeting and previous ISPOR meetings. And it underscores the importance of treating IRA readiness like HTA readiness. So really investing in scenario planning, cross-evidence indication, cross-indication evidence dossiers, and preparing for these for the US market in a similar way as for the international and established HTA. Second, having a robust RWE program is vital, as both CMS and ICER do their assessments many years after launch. Preparing for registries, cost offset studies, and subgroup analyses is becoming mission critical. And this is not relevant only for those products that are most at risk at being selected for the MFP negotiation. What we're really hearing from payers is that they're going to leverage the MFP in their contract negotiations for other products in those competitive segments. So preparing for defense file is now becoming more relevant across the board, not just for the MFP selected products. As we discussed before, because we have one MFP per molecule, this can dilute ROI across indications, potentially in some high-value indications and combinations as well. And that brings a new lens to the indication sequencing planning and a need to map out that evidence hierarchy as early as possible. And finally, as Priti mentioned, ICE's influence on CMS is growing, so that underscores the need to invest in the robust comparative data, prepare both economic and clinical dossiers, and really a close working between multiple functions, including HR, access, pricing, and commercial, to make the process successful. So this concludes our prepared set of the presentation, and we can now take any of your questions.
If you have questions, we've been told that you have to come to the mic because that's the only way we can hear you. I think
maybe
yeah.
now, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to maybe technical questions, I'm kind of curious as to how manufacturers respond in terms of their price. Are they at the same table as CMS when making these proposals? Like, do they collaborate together to basically submit a price? Or, yeah, I'm just wondering how these prices are being submitted to then be evaluated.
Yeah, so there's a whole timetable in terms of how the negotiations happen, and the specific dates, right? All submission in terms of evidence has to go in, I believe, on March 1st. And then there's the first set of negotiations, the second set of negotiations. So there's a lot of back and forth. And the back and forth is both qualitative as well as quantitative. So a manufacturer can bring in additional evidence to the table, which could basically change the narrative as well as the conversation. But you do start at a certain price. And that certain price is actually determined by CMS in terms of what that starting price is. And there's a whole lot more details which is associated with that as well. So, you know, in what we've read so far, heard so far, is that in some, like, you're constantly almost like dialing up, dialing down, right? But there are, it's a lot of back and forth over the course of the year, with the final price, I believe, final agreement on the MFP in the November timeframe.
I have another question, which is a bit funny. In the way that this IRA is sort of structured, I kind of see that, like, that they could have sort of taken the approach of sort of grandfathering sort of currently sort of reimbursed medications and then focused on drugs that are about to be launched. I kind of find it funny that they didn't focus on that, because there's a lot, I guess the pay would have had a lot more leverage in terms of getting sort of a better price when you're at, market start. I guess you're trying to reap like savings now. I guess was that the thinking behind the way that the program was structured?
Yeah, so the idea, and I should have said that, but the idea behind the act is really to evaluate products which have a high spend, firstly for the CMS beneficiaries, right? In addition to that, in instances where there are no generic options available or biosimilars available, because the intent is that when the generics and the biosimilars come into the market, that will automatically drop the price, right? And you do want biosimilars, you want incentives for companies to bring in biosimilars to the table, because again, you have competition in the market, and that will, result in some price erosion. But in the absence of a generic alternative option or a biosimilar, how after a couple of years, which Tijana alluded to, is it 7 and 13, right, Tijana? This is when CMS wants to have a negotiation with the manufacturers to see at this point in the product's life cycle, what is the maximum fair price, which is optimal for CMS beneficiaries.
Okay.
And this is only going to be for Part D and Part B beneficiaries.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I think we are on. Oh, there is one more question, but I don't think we can take a question. They're asking us not to take any additional questions, but we can always, talk outside, after the session is over. Well, thank you for your time.